Well, here we are again. We're back out here by the pond, by the sacred fire, which I'm not lighting. But today is important because it's the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox is not a day, and there's not a first day of spring per se. The vernal equinox is one of the four fiducials of the solar calendar, two of them being the solstices. The summer solstice is when the sun is at its most northern point in the northern hemisphere, and the winter solstice is when it's in the most furthest south point in the middle of the winter. The other two are halfway in between, approximately. Not exactly. We could talk about that a little bit, but the other two are the equinoxes, the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. Today's the vernal equinox. That's the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. It's the opposite in the southern hemisphere. And in these days of global communication, we need to talk about those folks down in Australia, New Zealand too, and also at the South Pole. So when I can, I will bring them in. But so the vernal equinox is an astronomical event. It's when the sun is at the halfway point between the summer solstice and the winter solstice. It's when the sun is coming up in the east, exactly due east, and it goes down in the west exactly due west. And it's been moving north ever since the winter solstice in December, and now it's reached the halfway point. It's due east, perfectly balanced. So today is a day of balance, traditionally, and that's probably the biggest attribute of the day. It's a day of balance. It is said that you can take an egg and spin it around on your kitchen table and it'll balance on one end on the day of the equinox, or precisely at the moment of the equinox, which is about an hour and a half away from right now. About 2 hours, actually. It's 8:49 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So it's a precise astronomical moment. There's a bit of quibbling then. For example, in England, their time is about 8 hours different from mine here. So sometimes these events will cross the midnight point to another day. So which day is the first day? Which day is the spring or not? Which day is the day of the vernal equinox? Depends on what time zone you're in. Unless you're going, purely by Greenwich Mean Time or Universal Time. But usually when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about Pacific Time. And in this case, it's daylight time, since that horrific thing, daylight time, started about a week ago. Started about 10 days ago. So, and it's pretty light out at the moment. So why is the vernal equinox important, besides the fact that it's a day of balance? Well, it's important because, like I said, it's one of the four fiducials of the calendar, the solar calendar. But in the old days, let's say back in the time of Stonehenge, the time of the Druids, those folks, they would have known when it reached the halfway point. Those old cultures knew north and south, and they knew east and west, and they determined east and west by this day. if you look at, you know, Stonehenge was built about the same time as the Great Pyramid was, give or take. The Great Pyramid, I guess, was built about 2500 BC. Stonehenge was built about 3000 BC, 3100 or so. But I once figured out that there seemed to be a remarkable coincidence where about the year 3100 BC, several of the calendars began at that time. It seems to coincide. But that's about the time that they've determined that Stonehenge was built, the very first versions of it. And the Great Pyramid a little bit later. A little bit, that's 500 years, 600 years. But the Great Pyramid, you know, it's four-sided, and the two sides go north and south. That's pretty easy to figure out because there's a North Star up there that they could be aligned with. But east-west is a little bit more difficult, but it's 90 degrees from the north-south. You can figure out the north-south at night by pointing it at by drawing a string or a rope or a cord, as they called it. There was an old Egyptian ceremony called the pulling of the cord, where they're surveying the location that they're going to put up a pyramid, and the very first step is to figure out the north-south line, and they do that at night by looking at the North Star. Then they pull a rope tight and draw a north-south line. The entrance corridor into the Great Pyramid is on the north side, and it goes straight down toward the south. It's perfectly aligned north-south, but it's also perfectly aligned pointing up at the North Star. Interesting fact. So they knew east and west too, because on those east-west sides of the Great Pyramid, those would become illuminated on this day. And now it starts to move north from this day on. So it would, from this day on, the north side of the Great Pyramid would be illuminated, whereas previous days it's not. So the Great Pyramid was nothing but a big, huge obelisk, a big, huge sundial, really, a calendar, if you will. So, for the longest time, they knew what these four fiducials were. They knew what the Vernal Equinox was. In ancient Babylon, they had something called ziggurats, and ziggurats are the predecessors of the pyramids. It came about the same time. They're like stepped pyramids, and the Babylonians had those. Sumerians, those were also aligned perfectly, north, south, east, west. And in that culture, in Babylon, they knew what the Vernal Equinox was, and that's when their calendar started. The calendar began on the Vernal Equinox, which made sense to them because that's the beginning of spring. It's like everything's been sleeping, it's been hibernating, it's been dead in midwinter, and then it wakes up in the spring, and little crocuses pop their heads up, and the animals come out, the bears come out from their hibernation, and then we move into summer and the rest of the year. So it made sense that the Vernal Equinox was the beginning of the year. So in Babylon, that's what they celebrated. The Egyptians didn't follow that, however. The Egyptians, their first day of their calendar, their solar calendar was on the summer solstice. There was a coincidence that they noted back in those days where the day of the sunrise of the summer solstice coincided with what they called the heliacal rising of Sothis. Sothis was Sirius, the dog star. So the dog star is invisible for a good part of the year, and then it suddenly appears on the horizon right before the sun rises, when it's still dark where you can see it, but it arises, and that's called a heliacal rising. And back in those days, that would happen right before the vernal equinox sunrise. So those two coincided. And that's why they thought it was a big deal. That's why they made the summer solstice the beginning of their calendar. But, so for both of those cultures, both of those old cultures, their calendars were solar ones, and they depended upon these fiducials, these important dates, and today is one of those, the vernal equinox. In modern times, well, I said Babylon started their calendar on the vernal equinox. In modern times, I'm saying modern, let's go back a couple thousand years, or 1,000 years or so. The Persian calendar. What is Persia? Persia is Iraq and Iran, mostly Iran. Persia. There was a bard, poet, a Sufi master named Omar Khayyam, Persian poet. And Omar Khayyam was also a mathematician and an astronomer, and also an astrologer. Back in those days, astrology and astronomy were the same things. So it turns out that it was Omar Khayyam, the esteemed astronomer, mathematician, who established the Persian calendar. And when did he start that calendar? When did it begin? It began on the vernal equinox. So ever since then, the Persian calendar has begun on the vernal equinox, and it has 12 months, and it so happens that the 12 months of the Persian calendar also are exactly the same as the 12 tarot, the 12 zodiac signs. The astronomical band, the zodiac band that goes around the Earth, in which all of the 12 constellations are that form our what would have come down to us as the zodiac. They begin with Aries, and there are 30 degrees in each sign. So the beginning of Aries is the first of Aries. The first of Aries is today. The first of Aries is the vernal equinox. That's the beginning. And so for the next month, that would be the month of Aries. And then after that would be the next month, and so forth, all the way through the zodiac. Well, in the Persian calendar, their names for their solar months coincide with those 12 zodiac signs. So the zodiac as we know it, astrology as we know it, conforms to this old Persian calendar. And in my opinion, that's my preferred choice of a calendar. It's meaningful. It makes sense. Our own calendar is a travesty. It's stupid. It's the result of a bunch of crazy decisions that were made back in the time of the Caesars, that changed the Roman calendar. The Roman calendar actually came originally from the from the Egyptian calendar. There was a lunar calendar in Rome too, but at one point Caesar took what he had learned of the Egyptian solar calendar and he adopted it to Rome. But there are all these crazy things about our current Gregorian calendar that came about, because of conflicts that had to be decided upon, and they weren't taking into account leap days and things like that. So eventually what happens is they decide to the Roman calendar actually, instead of being built around the vernal equinox, that Roman calendar is built around what's called Easter. It was designed so that they could figure out when Easter was, and surprisingly Easter is based on a formula that is based on the vernal equinox. But if you place Easter, if what you're basically trying to do is find the date of Easter, then you build your calendar around Easter, and you kind of like back your way into where the beginning of the calendar is going to be, where the New Year's Day is going to be, and that's how we end up in January 1st, and it's like 2 weeks after the winter solstice, and it's a time that has absolutely no astronomical significance at all. It's just stupid. It's a stupid day to from the point of view of astronomy or astrology. It's a stupid day to start such an important thing as a yearly calendar. I actually take it a bit further, and I think that a lot of the historical conflicts that we know of can actually be traced to conflicts about which calendar those people are going to follow. They're different cultures, they have different calendars, and so they fight over which calendar is going to win. And what happened is the Romans won, and therefore we have the Roman calendar, unfortunately. But some of us can keep on having the Persian calendar in the form of the zodiac. If you purchase one of these little booklets called the Pocket Astrologer, so that you can keep track of the positions of the planets, day by day, then you have your own personal Persian calendar in your pocket. The Pocket Astrologer. Look it up. It's one of the first things that I suggest that my students do, is get a Pocket Astrologer, carry it around with them. So that's why the vernal equinox is so important to me. It's important to pagans, Wiccans. It's important to other kinds of pagans in the Western Hermetic tradition. The indigenous peoples would have known what the day is, because we know that they had medicine wheels up on tops of mountains, astronomical observatories basically, where they figured out where the solstices were, and they could have figured out where the equinoxes were. So they knew the difference between a solar calendar and a lunar calendar. They were mostly taught, when they talk about a moon, they're talking about a month in their lunar calendar, and so most of them had lunar calendars. But they knew about the solar calendar too, because they had this medicine wheel. More than one. There's the Bighorn medicine wheel. It's up in Wyoming. So what else do I want to talk about? Oh, so why is this significant, or why is this appropriate for our discussion here? Well, it's because the the shamans would have been the ones who were the keepers of the calendar. That would have been their traditional role. So they would have gone up there on the top of the mountain in summer and checked what the day to the summer solstice, and actually the Sundance, a little bit of lore about the Lakota Sundance is that it takes place traditionally on a full moon. And on a full moon, the sun goes down on the opposite side of the earth as the moon is coming up on the other side. So on a day that you're doing the Sundance, if it's set on the proper days, what you're going to see is when the sun goes down, the moon is coming up in the east, sun is going down in the west, and vice versa. When the sun is coming up in the morning, the full moon is going down in the east. So see, they would have known that. They would have known about that. But that's part of the traditional lore of the Lakota shamans. And here's Nalhi, the spirit dog, and he needs to eat. Right? You hungry? Yeah, that's why he's here. So I'm going to go feed him. And that's chapter 10 of the secret lore of the Lakota shamans. Oh, Mitako, yes.